Pleasure to be here in this launch and initial steps of the My City Center within the Hieronymus Academy of Data Science. I'm very glad that this is being launched, and I'm very glad to be in Den Bosch, especially with this wonderful weather. The topic that I'm going to be talking about, and if my slides can come up, is going to be what makes cities dynamic. And what I'm going to start is basically with two facts. Do we have the slides? Oh, they're here, so I can find. So let me see. Okay. So what makes cities and countries dynamic? And I'm going to start with two facts that they're not going to be new to this audience. You know them, but it's just always good to restate them. The world is today an urban world, there's no doubt. There's much highlighted sort of statistic that in 2006, 2007, more than 50% of the population from that time, more than 50% of the population of the world is urban, and the trajectory that we expect is that it's going to go higher, so up to levels of close to 6 billion people by 2040. And that this is happening not just in certain places, this is happening worldwide. We go back 60 years earlier to 1960, 58 years earlier, the world was a world in which you can see by the colors over here, there was very little level of urbanization in many parts of the world. The light blue colors, for example, in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa are less than 25%, and the number of cities of more than 1 million was actually reduced and highly concentrated in parts of China, but especially in Europe and in North America. We fast forward until almost today. This is the map for 2011, and what we see is that the world has become much more urbanized everywhere, so darker colors, more than 75%, virtually in the whole American continent, many parts of Europe, but also much darker colors, more than 50% in most of the emerging countries of the world, with a massive proliferation of big cities. If we take a look at the case of China, today there are 104 cities of more than 1 million in China alone. So we're talking about a massive explosion of urban population. So the question that I'm going to be asking is this good or is this bad? And what are the implications for this for economic development? And there are three questions that are interrelated. The first one is, to what extent has this process of urbanization that we've seen over the last decades led to greater economic dynamism? Which are the types of cities that drive growth? Are the big cities, the small cities? Is urban concentration leading to more economic dynamism or less? And third, is the process the same in developed and in developing countries, or are there differences? And I'm going to start by what does the theory tell us? And I'm glad that Peter Emlund did his presentation in the way he did it, because he's saying that we have some sort of new old idea, new old fetishism with a type of city, which is the large city. Not just any large city, but the massive metropolis and massive agglomeration. This image that he was saying that there have been theories in the past that the US would be better off if all the population was concentrated in one city called metropolis. From an economic perspective, especially in recent decades, we have adapted more or less that sort of idea. The idea that the bigger the city, the bigger the agglomeration, the denser the city, the bigger the potential for economic growth, and that translated into the collective imaginary, translated into policy, that leads bigger cities are the drivers of growth. And in fact, when you take a look at the contributions of the new economic geography, the emphasis has been put mainly on city size, urban economics that has made a lot of other contributions. The emphasis has been somewhat, in some cases, unjustly simplified to the role of density. And there's a lot to say about size and density. In fact, many large cities across the world are drivers of growth. I work and live in a city called London, and the city has been extremely dynamic for the last 20 years, especially in comparison to the rest of the UK. But so it's the same for many other large cities. I'm thinking about Paris, I'm thinking about New York, thinking about Tokyo, or many large cities in emerging countries like, for example, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou in China. And very often, there seems to be this relationship that size and density actually do make a difference. When you take a look at the case of the UK, for example, London has traditionally been more dynamic in recent years than cities that are much smaller in size, for example, the case of Liverpool, and Liverpool in turn has been more dynamic than places that are traditionally smaller, like Newcastle or Sheffield, to put an example. But the same applies to other parts. Paris, if you take a look at Paris and the Ile-de-France, that's the only region in France that has grown above the average of the country, so has high level of concentration over the last 25 years, and that has been Paris more dynamic than Lyon, Lyon in turn more dynamic than Marseille, and Marseille in turn more dynamic than Lille. So possibly there's a story that size, agglomeration, density make a difference for urban growth. But of course, the problem is that we're dealing with social sciences. We're dealing with territories, we're dealing with cities, we're dealing with a phenomenon that is inherently messy, and it doesn't apply everywhere. We have, on the one hand, this areas that have highlighted that we are in a world of cities and the future is a world of cities. And when you go to, for example, the World Economic Forum in 2012, it had a seminal document highlighting that the 21st century will be the century of the city. And it doesn't mean any type of city. It means a century of big cities. That will be big cities will bring prosperity, they will bring more inclusion, greater partnership and interaction, and greater sustainability. The World Bank in its World Development Report also makes this sort of point in 2009 that cities are the main drivers of economic growth, and this has implications. They're aware that this would lead to unbalanced growth, but if you try to put in policies in place that would prevent this unbalanced growth, you're not fighting inequality. What you're fighting is prosperity. You're not addressing the problems of poverty. You are actually enhancing the problems of poverty. The problem, as I was saying before, is that this doesn't work all the time. Size and density not always matters, and not always makes a difference. All Latin American cities, I'm thinking about Bogota, I'm thinking about Lima, the large cities, I'm thinking about Santiago de Chile, and can be thinking about many other cities, but a city like Bogota, for example, has a very large population and is much denser than the equivalent American city. Yet that is no sign of economic dynamism. In fact, Bogota is not doing badly, but it could be doing much, much better if we were to just consider its size. And if we start looking across the world, for example, we see plenty of examples of former cities, well, not former cities, cities that were formerly richer, more dynamic, that has suffered despite being bigger and richer not that long ago than cities that were significantly smaller. One example is Montreal, the former economic capital of Canada, the city with the whole financial center of the country, and that has moved to Toronto over the last 30 years, a city that has overtaken not just in terms of population, but also in terms of economic dynamism. There's also this very interesting book by Michael Stolper and his collaborators about the comparison between the Bay Area, San Francisco, and LA, and despite LA being double the size of the Bay Area, how over the last 30 years the Bay Area has overtaken, and part of the country, in this case LA, that by no means is not dynamic. It's still dynamic, but it's much less than before. And if we go to developing worlds, the developing world, for example, we have to focus, we can take Calcutta, which was the pearl of the British Empire, the original capital of India, still a very large city with very limited evidence of dynamism, much more concentrated in other parts of India like Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai, for example, or even Hyderabad and Ahmedabad. So in this respect, there is evidence that not always size, not always greater agglomeration leads eventually to higher growth. I also want going to highlight that we think that London is very dynamic, and London has been very dynamic for the last 20 years, 25 years, but London was also performing badly relative to the rest of the UK between the late 1930s and 1995. So we had a period of decline before a period of takeover. And of course, when you go to many parts of the developing world, agglomeration and density doesn't necessarily mean growth. What we have seen is massive urbanization, concentration of people in places like Lagos, 21 million, by the way, places like Dhaka, Karachi, Kampala, big cities without corresponding economic growth. What we have had is jobless growth. So there are some gaps that might explain this, and there are some gaps that are very much related to the way we have analyzed and we have theorized on the basis of empirical evidence. One is that we have been based on evidence that has come primarily from high-income countries. And of course, we had the best data, the base data sets in those countries, but of course, the balance between economies of scale and positive externalities and negative externalities, these economies might vary depending on the level of development and on the size of the city. And it might not work in the same way in the developing world and in the developed world. Whereas big size in many parts of the developed world means better services, more agglomeration of talent, more agglomeration or synergies in terms of externalities through Jacobs or Marr or related varieties analysis. In the developing world, in many parts, this is not going to be replicated. Of course, there's a question of size. There has been a lot of emphasis from the World Bank that this growth is going to be unbalanced, but then is going to spread out. But there's a slight problem of dimension. It has happened before, we know. But when New York started to take off, or was about to take off, in 1870, it had a population of less than 1 million. Today, Lagos has probably not really taken off. The population is 21 million. Cairo is more than 90 million. So we're talking about a difference in dimension that is of considerable, there's a considerable gap in dimension. And of course, on top of that, we have similar gaps in terms of institutional quality and the way society works. Most of the analysis also have focus on productivity and productivity within the city, but they tell us relatively little, highlighting that the bigger the city, the greater the productivity, that if you multiply the size of the city, you increase productivity. They tell us relatively little about how that increase in productivity in the city affects not just neighboring areas, but also the rest of the country. And very often when we look at different city size categories in terms of size, they tend to be rather crude. Normally the distinction is we take cities as cities that are above 750,000 or 1 million, and there's very little distinction on that. So before I'm going, the cities as a result of that have been seen in two different ways. They can be seen as a curse, or big cities, the growth in urbanization, in which one of the main challenges we're going to have of this century is going to be actually dealing with the epic challenges that are posed by very often rapid and orderly urbanization in developing countries, or in some other cases is going to be a blessing that is going to lead to greater prosperity. I'm going to take this quote from the World Development Report 2009. No country has grown to high income without vibrant cities. The rush to cities in developing countries seems chaotic, but it is necessary. It seems unprecedented, but it has happened before. So the ball is very much in the air, and the verdict is still what type of cities actually make a difference for prosperity, for well-being, for economic development. What cities drive average economic growth, and what cities drive development. And what I'm going to present here, very briefly, is based on 3 papers that I have developed over the last 3 years. Well, 2 of them have been published in the last few months with Susanne Frick, who is a collaborator of mine at the LSE, focusing on 3 factors: average city size within a country, urban concentration, and city size categories, using the biggest data set that we could gather, so cross-country panel data study for 114 countries, covering large swaths of the developed, well, virtually every developed country, plus large swaths of the developing world, over a period of 50 years between 1960 to 2010 in intervals of 5 years, and using a very wide range of methods, from simple OLS to panel data to instrumental variable analysis, Hausman-Taylor analysis, and dynamic panel data analysis. This is not the type of audience where I don't have the time. I'm just going to summarize here the key results. The first one is that average city size, as you would have expected, has increased throughout the whole period, but what has driven the increase in average city size is not the average city size of in developed countries, in high-income countries, is the average city size in developing countries. By the way, just to clarify, we take every city in a country that has more than 50,000 people. And what we've seen that the average city size in developing countries has grown between more than 200,000 in 1960 to levels of more than 800,000 by 2010. So clearly, there has been an expansion of city size fundamentally driven by the developing world, because in high-income countries, the change has been much lower, from 450,000 to less than 600,000. The question is, has this increase in average city size led to greater economic growth, especially in the developing countries? What we find is that there's no correlation between increase in average city size and economic growth in the whole sample, across the whole sample, and in all developing countries, when you just look at developing countries. Here you can see, whichever way you measure it, there's nothing there. If anything, when you do instrumental variable analysis, the connection between average city size, concentration, greater growth of cities in developing countries is associated to lower levels of growth. That's not the case in high-income countries, the places where the theory has been developed, that there's a positive association between average city size and growth. So here we have the first division. What seems to work in the developed world, and what we seem to be preaching as a result of the theory that we have learned in terms of policy, especially over the last 10 years or 15 years now, that has potentially worked in the most high-income countries, is not working in developing countries. Third finding, urban concentration. The idea that if you concentrate population in the most developed parts, in the cities, which are theory the most dynamic, you're going to achieve also greater growth. Well, we're finding, and we look at 2 types of different concentration. We use Herfindahl indices, including all cities in a country of more than 50,000. We've done it also for more than 100,000, and the results don't change at all, so I'm not reporting them here. And because, of course, the size of cities varies, you have a massive number of cities of more than 50,000 in China. You have very few in a country like Luxembourg. We take the 25 largest cities in every country, if you get 25 cities that are more than 50,000. And what we find is that whereas in Europe and Asia, there has been virtually no change, regardless of the indicator, in urban concentration over the last 50 years, in contrast to expectations and to what has been very often proposed or is being proposed in terms of policy developments in recent years, in Africa and in the Americas, urban concentration has declined. It means that in terms of population, since the 1960s, very often population growth is faster in smaller and medium-sized cities than in the largest cities. And this might not be that bad, because when you take a look at urban concentration and the link between urban concentration and economic growth, again, we find no connection. Across the whole sample, across developing countries, and if you push me, across developed countries. The link between urban concentration and economic growth seems to be, in our results, fundamentally a European phenomenon. That's where we find it. That more concentrated countries, in terms of urban concentration, do better in Europe, but not elsewhere. And if we put everything together, you can see the global sample, there's nothing. In the case of non-European countries, whether developed or less developed, there's nothing. In the case of Europe, what we find is some positive link between urban concentration and growth. And then the final finding is about city size categories. And here, the results are very similar for the developed and the developing countries for the first time. And we have a series of categories and how they contribute to national economic growth. Below 500,000, from 500,000 to 1 million, 1 million to 3 million, 3 million to 7 million, 7 million to 10 million, and the real megalopolis more than 10 million. And here again, in contrast to expectations, we find that, in fact, big cities, more than 3 million in general, there's no connection between the presence of those type of cities and national growth. More than 10 million, also nothing, if anything, some sort of negative association. The biggest positive association is found in the smaller cities of up to 500,000. And this is a result that is consistent for developed and developing countries. So what can we say about this? First, that there's no uniform relationship between average city size, agglomeration, and average city size, urban concentration, and agglomeration in terms of large cities, and economic growth. That if anything, smaller cities tend to be much more dynamic, and especially in smaller countries. Second, that there's no evidence of link between city size and economic growth, especially in developing countries. So this idea that we should perhaps in many parts of the world, and especially in many parts of the developed, promote the growth of large cities might be somewhat misplaced. If anything, if it has worked somewhere, it has been mainly across the developed world. That urban concentration there's only evidence that it's conducive to economic growth in Europe. There's nothing elsewhere. And there's no evidence of such an effect whatsoever in developing countries. So overall, what is coming is that possibly the increasing focus that we have seen, perhaps through some simplified, naive interpretations of the theoretical contributions of new economic geography and urban economics, has been somewhat misplaced and is probably in many cases counterproductive. Going to a country like Ghana and saying, try to focus on not what you have been doing before, which is traditionally putting resources into rural areas, but focus on where you have your best bet, which is Accra, your biggest city, in order to make your city a competitive city in the global stage, may not work. It is a risky bet. You're betting on one horse and only one horse without the knowledge that your horse is the favorite. Because before we were thinking perhaps from what theory is telling us, it's better to bet on Accra than to bet on intermediate cities or to bet on smaller cities. What we're finding is that might not be the case. In many parts of the developing world, what we are doing is moving poverty from rural areas, from smaller cities into bigger cities. But the prospects, at least in the short and medium term, over a period of 60 years, of transforming that into actual prosperity and better quality of life for individuals and welfare are not evident across the board. So what we need to focus and remember ourselves that what makes a city great, what makes a city dynamic, and what transforms as a result societies is not its size, is not its density, but what type of institutions, what type of governance, what type of endowment of human resources do you have there, how accessible your cities are. So in other words, not making a city big, but making a city smarter. And that we fall, if we're going to, because we have limited resources, if we're going to have to make a bet, we're going to have to realize that we're going to have not to bet on size, but to bet on smart potential. Meaning that sometimes not all big cities, and I'm not saying big cities should not be invested in. They should, and sometimes you need to address big cities because they're going to be motors of economic growth. But not all big cities are going to have that potential. And very often, in many parts of the world, it's the medium-sized cities and the smaller cities that are going to contribute. Also, if you think that a big city is going to be able to do it on its own, perhaps you might want to invest in those areas that have significant potential to create dynamism, but that might need that additional extra push in order to make them smarter and therefore contribute better to the welfare of the individuals living there and the welfare to all individuals living in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. A lot to think about there. I think we've probably got time for one question.
Denise?
Thank you, Andres, for this prodigious information. I fully agree with your last conclusions, especially regarding big versus smart and importance of policies. But I have a technical question regarding your measurement of urban concentration, because besides the absolute size that you use as a stick for comparisons, perhaps relative size is more significant according to the system of cities with which each city is connected. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, no, absolutely. I think that's a very relevant question. We had to simplify when we measure urban concentration. We do it in that paper on using Herfindahl indices on just the size of more than 50,000, 100,000, and the 25 largest cities. We develop much less the idea of relative size relative to the size of the country, which we do when we look, Suzanne and I, look at the city size categories. There we do it also, the analysis is done relative to the size of the country and how the cities are connected. And that's where we come with a result that I haven't elaborated here because of lack of time, that very often smaller cities make a much higher contribution in smaller countries than in larger countries. Country size matters for the performance of city size and also vice versa. And that's something that I think, although we touch upon it, is a concept that needs to be developed and needs to be developed much further in future research by all people here.
Take one more question.
Thank you very much.
And the microphone.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to suggest to consider FAVA model approaches, which can be very, very useful to take into account not only space but also time in a dynamic, non-linear manner. And you do not need so many a priori assumptions concerning factors and so on. This would be my suggestion.
Okay. So, I think you need to focus on, when you're dealing with cities and when you're dealing with geography is not just about space, it's about time. And you might need, what we do consider is a relatively large period of time. That's the most, for which we could have gathered data, 1960 until 2010. Having said that, of course, you can do more methodological, sophisticated analysis in order to see whether this is robust. Having said that, we tried a large raft of methods, and most of the results, actually all the results, are strongly consistent regardless of the method that you use.
Okay. Call a halt there. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
indeed, Andrej.